Today I'd like to propose that forgiveness changes our beliefs. When we forgive our enemies, the messages in our heart change from condemning to grace-filled. Likewise, we experience God's forgiveness when we forgive our enemies. How exactly does that all work? To start, I'd like to ask a question. What exactly are forgiveness and unforgiveness? I want to propose something that you may or may not have thought of. Unforgiveness is essentially human worship. That is to say, it's a thing that happens when we idolize another person. For context, I'd like to trace it all the way back to the Garden of Eden when the snake tempted Eve to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. When you eat of the fruit, you'll become like God, the snake said. I want to suggest that that's the essence of sin. We want to be God. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe we don't like having to trust Him or don't like obeying Him. Maybe we want to take His position. Maybe we want His glory. I'm not quite sure why we want to take His role, but it seems that we do. Now, if sin involves trying to take God's role, it makes sense to try and define His role a bit, particularly His role in our lives. Perhaps we can gain some insight into the nature of sin by doing this. When I think of human beings, one of the defining characteristics that comes to mind is needs. We didn't make ourselves. Our very existence is dependent. God made us with a need for food, water, air. He made us for fellowship with Himself and with other people. We need to perform our function as individuals uniquely designed by God. That is to say, we have a need for purpose. Along those lines, and above all, we have what I call identity needs. We need to know who we are. In particular, we need to know that we're deeply, deeply loved. So essential are these needs that if they aren't met, we die. We need to know that we are unconditionally accepted and cherished. We're very needy. Prior to the fall, prior to our decision to go after God's role, all our needs were met by God. And then we ate the fruit. We said, God, thanks, but no thanks. And God said, okay. Well, we quickly realized that we bit off more than we could chew. We were so busy fantasizing about not having to trust God or obey Him or being in control or getting the glory that goes with His role that we forgot all about our needs. Okay, you can be me, God said. Have fun taking care of yourself. I made you a God-sized handful. And from that day forward, we've been doing a crummy job of taking care of ourselves. And you better believe we try. God built in all sorts of alarms that go off when our needs aren't met. And they aren't fun. For example, what happens when you don't eat? You get hungry, or worse, hangry. What happens if you don't have access to air? These alarms drive us to tend to our needs. But I want to focus on a different need for a second. It's our pinnacle need, our identity's need. We need to believe that we're in right standing with God and that He esteems us. Do you know what happens when that need isn't met? You probably all felt it in varying degrees throughout your lives. Many of us are all too familiar with the negative messages in our hearts and the feelings they produce. Some might refer to this as the God-sized hole in our hearts. Personally, I think it's literally a glimpse of hell. Fortunately, though, we have God's creation to run to, escaping the acute agony and despair of self-condemnation and numbing ourselves to it. Having taken over for God, that's what we've been reduced to, worshiping the creation instead of the Creator. Although it's but a cheap knockoff of the real thing, we leverage anything that can make us feel good about ourselves for a bit. Now, of all the things in creation that we leverage to try and fill the needs of our identity, one makes the top of the list: other people. I mean, it makes sense, right? Not only are we the pinnacle of His creation, but we also bear His image. See, our identity needs were meant to be met directly by God Himself. And as image bearers, people have some of His capacities. Likewise, we come the closest thing to being able to fill that need for acceptance and esteem, where the rest of creation falls quite short. Now, we'll tie this into forgiveness in a bit, but until then, I'd like to examine this human worship dynamic a bit more closely. In John's Gospel, Jesus makes an awesome statement. He says, "How can you believe in me when you receive glory from one another, but don't seek the glory that comes from the only God?" That's right. Receiving glory from other people and believing in Jesus are two mutually exclusive things. As with the love of money, you can't have two masters, right? You'll either love one and despise the other, or hate one and love the other. So it is with receiving glory from man and receiving glory from God. To do both at the same time just doesn't happen. But what does it mean to receive glory from someone, whether it be God or man? And what does that have to do with forgiveness? To receive glory from someone is, put simply, to care what they think about you. It's to be concerned with the acceptance, approval, validation, affirmation, or otherwise esteem of God or man. Think about it. What does it mean to glorify something? To make much of it, right? To think it's awesome, cool, fascinating, captivating, worthy, etc. It's to give it your vote of approval or awe. And to receive glory is to be concerned with those things, to seek those things, whether they be from God or man. Now, there are some fundamental differences between the glory that comes from God and the glory that comes from man. This is important. The glory that comes from man is 100% earned by its recipient. To receive glory from man is actually just to make much of yourself. It's an endeavor of pride. But the glory that comes from God is 100% earned by Jesus. To receive it, by contrast, is to make much of Jesus, and great humility is necessary. Last time we talked about how belief, though powerful enough to receive love, is, in a way, very passive. True love is freely given. If there are strings attached, it ceases to be love. Likewise, true belief doesn't try to buy love. If it does, it makes much of itself, and it ceases to be belief. Therefore, to truly believe is to glorify the one whose love you're freely receiving. And this can be starkly contrasted with receiving glory from man. Let me zoom out a bit on that passage from John. "I've come in my Father's name," Jesus says, "and you have not received me. But if someone else comes in their own name, you will receive him." How can you believe when you receive glory from each other, but don't care about the glory that comes from the only God? That's chapter 5, verse 43 and 44. In this passage, we have receiving glory from each other going hand in hand with coming in your own name. And both of these things being contrasted with believing in Jesus and, by the same token, God, in whose name Jesus came. You see, there's this sort of economy in the world whereby people exchange glory for other people coming in their own name. People walk around making much of themselves, trying to buy some love, and everyone buys into this system, gladly glorifying one another. Is it truly love? Of course not. It can't be, because it was bought. And it's for this reason that glorifying each other as we come in our own names is mutually exclusive with true belief. belief simply doesn't attempt to buy love. Period. So we've got two fundamentally different, mutually exclusive modes of operation. In one, we come in Jesus' name by belief, seeking the glory that comes from the only God. And in the other, we come in our own name, seeking the glory that comes from man. Now, it's kind of a mouthful for me to say, coming in your own name, seeking the glory of man because you tried to play God and now have a giant hole in your heart because you can't do for yourself what God was doing for you. What happens when that person rejects them in some way? I'll tell you what happens, though many of you don't need me to. Many of you have been there before, and I'm not an exception to that. I can tell you from personal experience exactly what happens when you get rejected in some way by someone that you idolized even a little bit. What happens is that instead of grieving the rejection accordingly, we remain in denial of the fact that it happened, or at least in denial of the fact that a solution to that rejection cannot be found in the person who rejected us. And that, you guys, that denial, that inability to grieve the facts, is unforgiveness. It's in its essence, unforgiveness is an inability to grieve rejection because our survival in this fallen world was depending on that person's glory. We don't grieve the rejection because it appears to be a threat to our survival, and that phenomenon is unforgiveness. You see, by denying the facts, we can create sort of a false reality for ourselves. And that functions much like the reality we were living in before the rejection. If we deny the rejection, it still does something for our identity needs. Although in reality, we no longer have that person's glory to tend to our needs, in our minds we still do. And that's the purpose of this denial or refusal to grieve. As I mentioned, this all has its roots in the human worship mode that many of us, even as believers, tend to inhabit at times. To idolize something is to assign it the role of God in our lives. Idolizing or worshiping people involves placing God-sized expectations on God's creation, namely other humans. I want to suggest that all unforgiveness can just be chalked up to having God-sized or unrealistic expectations of someone. In particular, it's an inability to adjust those expectations after the person we idolize has clearly displayed their inability to meet them. Now, I know that may not sound like a classic definition of unforgiveness. Usually we think of unforgiveness as demanding payment for a moral debt. And we think of forgiveness as waiving that payment. And this is not far off, but I think it's too narrow of a definition. I would broaden it by saying that unforgiveness is demanding that someone meet our expectations of them. And likewise, forgiveness is letting go of those expectations. Let me show you what that looks like in a few different scenarios. I'm going to talk a little faster now, out of respect for your time. Number one, we desperately want someone's glory so we can feel good about ourselves. They reject us. They don't meet the expectations we placed on them. Unwilling to let go of those expectations, we continue to hold out hope that one day that person will meet those expectations. For example, when I was 20, my girlfriend broke up with me. She never treated me well, to be honest. Despite that, I continued to tell myself the timing just wasn't right. It'll work out someday. I couldn't adjust my expectations to reflect the facts. Not only had she dumped me, she was never really that good for me in the first place. This inability to adjust my expectations to reflect reality was an example of unforgiveness rooted in my worship of this girl. Second scenario, this one's a little more classic. Starts out the same. We want someone's glory because we need it to fill the God-sized hole in our heart. They don't give it to us. In fact, maybe they even mistreat us. But instead of wishing they would change and meet our expectations, we develop a sudden desire for that person to pay dearly for hurting us. Now, maybe we call it a desire for justice, but it's not. There's nothing just about one sinner pointing the finger at another, especially when the only worthy judge has extended forgiveness to both. This isn't a desire for justice, it's unforgiveness. We're simply unwilling to let go of the expectation that that person has the capacity to make it better. We're unwilling to let go of the notion that the solution to our hurt can somehow be found in that person. You see, this is the insanity of unforgiveness. We look to the problem for the solution, and we refuse to quit. In this scenario, while we may not consciously acknowledge our desire for that person's glory, that's exactly what's underneath the desire that they pay. If we can't get their glory, we'll settle at least for making them hurt as much as we do. And number 3, in this scenario, we do nothing but hope that the offending party will simply be a decent human being. We've treated them well, we're innocent in the matter, and they wronged us severely. A drunk driver kills a loved one with their car. Someone abuses you in some form. Someone lies, steals from you, cheats you, deceives you, manipulates you. Now, your expectations of this person were not God-sized. You were merely expecting that they would not severely wrong you, right? And that's understandable. However, if after the incident you're not willing to adjust those expectations, then they are in fact God-sized. And here's why. In asking your offender to pay for the hurt they caused you, you're assigning them God's job. It's God's job to deal with your hurt and resolve it. By harboring unforgiveness towards them, you're going to them for what you should be going to God for. Why expect the solution to your hurt to be found in the very person who caused it? Unrealistic expectations. Gotta let them go. Now, all these scenarios have one thing in common. You're going to the problem for the solution. And as long as we do that, the problem, our hurt, won't be resolved. Whatever message we may have received from them when they failed our expectations will keep on playing in our heads as long as we look to them for the solution, because they will never provide it. It cannot be found in them. Imagine a TV for a second with a bunch of channels. Each channel is playing some sort of self-talk message. Your dad is yelling at you. Your girlfriend's breaking up with you. Your spouse is sinning against you. Your friend is betraying you. A total stranger is wronging you, in some severe way, or maybe just cutting you off on the road. Each channel carries with it a message about you. Essentially some form of you deserved it. You see, every action carries with it a truth claim, but many of these claims are actually lies. These lies, they make you feel like trash. As a side note, they also perpetuate whatever behaviors you might engage in to medicate those feelings. Unforgiveness, the refusal to let go of your expectation of that person, is like staring at that channel, hoping it will just magically change or something. But all you're doing is prolonging your exposure to that message. This is why people say unforgiveness is like drinking poison expecting the other person to die. The channel won't change. and you'll just continually relive the hurt that it inflicted. Here's a better idea. Change the channel. Stop going to that person who hurt you for the solution. Moreover, there's one problem with expecting people not to sin against you. Everybody does it. That includes you. And the source of all the sin in the world is the fruit that Adam and Eve ate in the Garden of Eden. And I'm here to say that either one of us would have done the same thing, introducing sin into the world. So in one sense, we live in a fallen world that we all share equally in creating. It's time to accept that we all fall desperately short of love. It's time to stop wasting time pointing our finger at our fellow human beings. I understand why we expect each other to be decent, but the fact is, we're all very, very far from that, and we need to lower our expectations of each other accordingly. Now, this is also important. In fact, this is very key. Unforgiveness is not spun into motion by the offense of the other person. It hinges entirely on our expectations of that person. If you walk around in denial of how absurdly broken our world is, expecting that people will be God or even just decent human beings, you've already set yourself up for injury. Unrealistic expectations are the foundation for all unforgiveness. If we carry them, every single person we interact with will be a ticking time bomb, just waiting to go off. I'm so convicted of this that sometimes I utter the words, "I forgive you," under my breath to total strangers. I'm serious. I will be walking down the street and I'll see someone, usually a cute girl, and I can just feel my heart shift. I want glory from that person. I've already laid the groundwork for offense and injury. I've already got unforgiveness towards this person. I'll probably never get close enough to them to experience the time bomb when it goes off, but the potential is there because my expectations are. So that said, here's a fourth scenario. In this scenario, you recognize that the person never really wronged you, but you feel so hurt and offended. Perhaps you still want glory from them, or perhaps you're bent on payment. In any case, you're confused about how to forgive someone when they did nothing objectively wrong. Unforgiveness is defined by the expectations, not the person's actions. Forgiveness is a releasing of those expectations. Therefore, you can still forgive someone who never objectively wronged you. So here's what I want to offer you now. Forgiveness is releasing the right or expectation that somehow the person who you feel wronged by will solve your problem or make you feel better. If unforgiveness is a denial of the sinfulness and weakness of humans that we idolize and an inability to grieve that fact, then forgiveness is the opposite. It's a recognition that we walk amongst a bunch of fallen sinners. They don't even meet standard for humans, much less God. Moreover, we're one of them. We need to come out of denial about this. We need to grieve this. We need to release our expectations of people and place them onto the only one who can resolve all our sin and hurt, Jesus. And now I've arrived at the point, finally. By forgiving people, by letting go of our God-sized expectations of them, we switch modes. In laying down our expectations of people, forgiving them, our identity can begin the return journey back into the capable hands of God. By forgiving people, we can start receiving glory, the glory that comes from God. the only one who can meet our needs. Previously, as our own gods, we came in our own name, pridefully using the glory that comes from man to make us feel good about ourselves. And when they didn't glorify us, our God-sized needs were left unmet. Rather than suffer, we created a false reality by denying the obvious incompetence of our fellow human beings to meet those needs. That is to say, we harbored unforgiveness. And many of us have been limping along like this in some capacity for our whole lives. We don't have to live like this. You guys, God gave Jesus' life for us so that we could have His righteousness. We have the righteousness of Christ if we receive it by belief. Not only that, God glorifies us on account of this righteousness. You guys, the world thinks a lot of things are cool, and if you do them, the world might give you its glory. God thinks one thing is cool: righteousness. And in His eyes, that's exactly what you are on account of Jesus. God esteems you. He thinks you're awesome. He delights in you. You guys, God glorifies you. You don't just make the cut in His sight. You don't just scrape by with a passing grade. You're not only justified. As far as God is concerned, you are the coolest. Not on account of your works that you might boast, but on account of Jesus. You see, here's how it works. If you stop coming in your own name and you start boasting in Jesus, God boasts in you. And we can live in that reality today. You guys, I can't even begin to tell you how thirsty I've been for the glory of man all my life. Some of you guys might be able to relate. Did you ever think that you could have the glory of God? All we have to do is forgive our enemies. Forfeit the method we've been using to get our identity needs met. Grieve the fact that it never did the trick to begin with. Grieve the fact that our fellow human beings are desperately fallen. Grieve the fact that without God, we are dry bones, the walking dead. We can't play God. We can't take care of our needs. Forgive your enemies. Forgive your enemies and come to Jesus instead. You can't have two masters. You can't at once get your identity from our fellow human beings and from God. It's one or the other. If you've been getting it from humans, forgive them, grieve them, adjust your expectations of them. Come out of denial. Stop going to the problem for the solution. Let go of the notion that they can make it even a little bit better. Change the channel. I've touched a couple of times on this idea that failed expectations communicate a certain message to us. These are the tracks from our past playing on repeat in our heads. These are our beliefs. They're powerful. They run our lives. Most of what we feel, want, think, and do stems from our beliefs. It's of utmost importance that we tend to them. If we don't forgive our enemies, we are settling for the messages that they have suggested about us. If we don't forgive our enemies, we're settling for poisonous beliefs and all the negative fruit they produce in our lives. We have to change the channel. And we can do that by forgiving the people who failed our expectations. Forgive, and you'll be forgiven. Does it make a little more sense? If you forgive your enemies, you'll stop going to them to have your identity needs met. If you forgive your enemies, you're free to have them met in Jesus. If you forgive your enemies, you break ties with the messages from your past. If you forgive your enemies, you can begin to absorb the message of the gospel. You can begin to believe that on account of Jesus, God both forgives you and glorifies you, that God thinks you are awesome and he delights in you. Jesus says, how can you believe when you seek glory that comes from man, but not the glory that comes from God? That means if you let go of the glory that comes from man, you can believe. If you forgive your enemies, your beliefs will begin to change from self-condemning to grace-filled. Forgive, and you'll be forgiven. Thank you.